Welcome back to CBS Sports HQ. Ryan Wilson's quarterback rankings. Here's the thing. We're down to a handful of games for college football teams left, unless, you're going to go to the playoff or whatever. You get things like the combine and pro days, but players are still looking to make a statement to prove how they can perform at the next level on the field. Now, this year's quarterback class, not absolutely outstanding, but it is better than last year where we saw just one quarterback drafted in the first 2.5 rounds. So how do the quarterbacks going into this year's draft stack up against one another? Here is what Ryan Wilson has. Bryce Young coming in at number 1, despite being undersized, according to many, and despite not having a great performance against LSU. CJ Stroud coming in at number 2. We're going to ask him about CJ Stroud because Tom Fornelli had CJ Stroud in his quarterback rankings take a tumble all the way to number 5, saying he has subpar performances. Anthony Richardson, with all of his athleticism, coming in at number 3, followed by Will Levis, and then Hendon Hooker, who has made quite the name for himself, coming in at number 5. Let's welcome in the guy behind the rankings, Ryan Wilson, here heading into week 11 in college football. Ryan, it has flown by. So you have Bryce Young at the very top. I mentioned, look, that game against LSU was not fantastic there. If anybody can respond, it's going to be him. The undersized, we've talked about that quite a bit. So why is he coming in at number 1 for you?
Well, Amanda, shout out to you because you did a great job of going through those players and pretty much identifying all the issues, pluses and minuses with them. So maybe you should be the draft guy. Good job there. But so you're exactly right about Bryce Young and the size issue. And you talk to some NFL teams and they're concerned about it because historically you don't find guys who are Bryce's height and weight, and the weight's a big part of it, who go on to have a lot of NFL success. But at the end of the day, you can't go on what you're hoping for. Hope isn't a plan, as the old saying goes. And when you watch Bryce Young, he is heads and tails better than every other quarterback in this class, to the point that he is a special player. I know you mentioned the LSU game, and he struggled at times, but he did a lot of things really well in that game. And you have to remember that he doesn't have all those 5-star first-round picks at wide receiver that he's throwing the ball to like Mac Jones and Tua Tagovailoa did. He's throwing to guys that are struggling to get open. He's having to make all these plays like you see here with his feet. He's keeping Alabama in games that they would have lost historically had there been other quarterbacks under center, including Tua and Mac, if we're being honest. And I think if you take all this in totality, you get over really quickly. Like this play here is insane. Yes, it's an interception, but very few quarterbacks in the league, let alone college football, are able to get open enough to make that throw, a no-look pass as it turns out. But here's the thing. The way he's played, he has elevated his game above every other quarterback in this draft class. He is my number 1 quarterback, and by the time it's over, maybe he's battling Will Anderson to be the number 1 player. I've loved what he's done this season under trying circumstances.
You're QB1. How do you think teams are evaluating him right now, though, when they're looking at all these players? I mean, is he going to be the first quarterback that we likely see go off the board?
That's the question. And I was talking to a former GM earlier who could not say enough good things about Bryce Young. And my follow-up was, okay, historically, how do you feel about these quarterbacks that are this size? And the answer was, well, you don't take them this early because of what history tells us. But I think he's going to be the exception. Part of the concern is that the rest of the quarterback class, and you mentioned Tom Fornelli's rankings, they're not pushing Bryce Young for that first overall pick unless you're drafting solely on projections. Bryce Young is doing it now. He's doing it at a high level, and NFL teams are going to have a come-to-Jesus conversation about whether they're willing to take a risk on his size, given that the upside, it's already there. You're not waiting for projectability. You know what he can do because he does it each and every weekend.
So let's talk about CJ Stroud coming in at number 2. He does have the size, 6'3", about 220 right now. Some of his stats, 28th nationally in passing efficiency, 46th in completion percentage, 41st in touchdown rate. Why is he coming in at number 2 for you?
Because he's the best quarterback in terms of what the future looks like as we sit here. Maybe Will Levis, maybe Anthony Richardson exceed those expectations in the future. But right now, I think Fornelli is right. There's a big gap between Bryce Young and everyone else, and C.J. Stroud just happens to be number 2 for me. He hasn't had a great year. There's no doubt about it. He does a lot of things really well. I don't think he is as far along as Justin Fields was at this point in his Ohio State career. It's taken Justin Fields a year and a half to get acclimated in Chicago, partly because of the coaching, but a lot of it has to do with Justin Fields, and I think C.J. Stroud could take a similar path. But what you have to remember is he's throwing to a lot of wide open guys, and he's hitting them, and easy enough, but it gets a lot more difficult once you get to the next level. And Marvin Harrison isn't out there, who might be the best player in college football right now, even though he's not draft eligible. And what happens when you go to a bad football team? Because that's what happens with these quarterbacks. So I think there is something to the concerns about the consistency, the accuracy. Last week's Northwestern game doesn't matter. It was 40-mile-an-hour winds, and it was hard to throw the football. But prior to that, he has not been as consistent as you would like to see. Doesn't mean he can't be, but it just means we need to temper our expectations about him coming in right away to some NFL team that will almost likely have a losing record and turning around that franchise in a few months.
Let's talk about the guy coming in at number 3 on your rankings behind Bryce Young, CJ Stroud. You have Anthony Richardson. Look, we know about his athleticism. This Florida Gators team has left things to be desired when it comes to the season. Why is he number 3 for you? How are you evaluating his performance? Maybe what teams are looking at?
Part of me wants Anthony Richardson to return to school. I had this conversation with a few teams last year about Sam Howell. It might have made more sense for him to come back. Sam Howell is a great athlete. He is not in the same conversation with Anthony Richardson. He has a ton more experience coming out of college, however. Coming into the year, Richardson had only thrown something like 60 passes. And that shows up when you watch him play this year. He just is so inexperienced, but the highs are so incredibly high that they take your breath away at times. And the lows are things you expect from young quarterbacks learning the position. So like I said, maybe it makes sense for him to come back. But look, he may very well decide to come out based on the fact that you make a lot of money in the NFL, and we'll see what the NIL side of that, if that weighs in at all. But NFL teams will take chances. I know NFL teams are really high on him, but it's a projection. And I talked about Bryce Young being the exception. The rest of this list are guys who are incredibly athletic and for various reasons have parts of their game that they need to work on. But when I watch Anthony Richardson, if you squint, you see a little Dante Culpepper, you see a little Josh Allen when they were in their most raw forms. But you have to figure out, what does this look like in 3 or 4 or 5 years? And that's what makes this so incredibly difficult. Yeah, you can take him now, but you have to understand that he can't play right away. The expectations are typically different for NFL teams who've won 2 or 3 football games when you draft a quarterback. He ain't going to sit there for 2 or 3 years like he's Aaron Rodgers or Phillip Rivers back in the day. So that's the calculus you have to figure out when you take someone like Anthony Richardson.
Have you heard anything about whether he would choose to go back or go into the draft?
I've only heard reports, and this was a few weeks ago, that he might be leaning towards coming out, but those are reports, and I haven't talked to anyone specifically about that. So we'll see how it unfolds. Selfishly, I would like to see him come back and get a little more experience, but he may feel otherwise, and I wouldn't blame him for coming out if he chose to do so.
Ryan, Chris Trapasso just had his latest mock draft come out. He has your guy sitting at 4th right now, going 5th overall to the Colts in Will Levis there. Look, he is big, he is strong, he has a strong arm. We have seen flashes of that athleticism for him. What is his projection right now? Why do you have him sitting 4?
Trapasso's not alone in thinking that, and I was on the Will Levis bandwagon for the longest time. But after a while, like I said earlier when we were talking about Bryce Young, at some point you have to trust your eyes, and Will Levis has had a tough season. Now look, the offensive line in Kentucky lost a couple of guys to the draft. They have not been very good. The playmakers around him have not been very good on the outside, and he's battled injuries, and those are things you have to take into account. But when you watch him play, he makes a lot of mistakes that leave you wondering, how could you take him with a top 10 pick? Again, we'll figure out all the injury stuff and how much it plays into his struggles. But he's another guy who's drawn comparisons to Josh Allen. When Josh Allen was coming out of Wyoming, go back and watch some of those Wyoming games. Josh Allen plays with a lot more consistency with players who aren't in the NFL. And this SEC team is a good football team. They play against tough competition. And Will Levis, on a team that runs the ball a lot, by the way, struggles to make simple throws at times, struggles with consistency, struggles with decision making, and those are the things that gives you pause, especially if you're picking in the top 5. And the thing with the Colts are, they very well may be in the Will Levis business, but you wonder about the blowback after the long stretch of failures at the quarterback position after Andrew Luck, and how that may determine whether they want to go all in on a guy who has so much to prove in terms of growing into the role, or maybe they want to settle on trying to get a Bryce Young, for example. So there's a lot to unpack. I think you hit on something, Amanda. We said this quarterback's class is better than last year's. It may end up not being by much, depending on how this thing plays out, because we're starting to see a leveling of the field as we get late into the college football season.
When you start diving into it, I was thinking that coming into this. All right, let's talk about Hendon Hooker here, coming in at number 5. Look, he's made a name for himself. He's made some money definitely this season. He has forced NFL teams to take a harder look at him with what Tennessee has done. How are you evaluating him, and maybe how can he help himself over these next couple of games?
Yeah, he's helped himself a ton without question. He was a day 3 guy over the summer for me. He's now a day 2 guy based on the way he's played. The issues are he'll be 25 once the season starts, and that's not necessarily a huge deal for quarterbacks. It's not like he's a running back or a wide receiver or cornerback, so that's less of a concern. But he plays in an offense that doesn't easily translate to the NFL. A lot of choice routes. We heard that conversation last week during the Georgia game, and that was his worst game of the season against one of the best teams defensively in college football. He also doesn't take much of a drop, which is also part of that offense, but that doesn't translate to the next level. He struggled to run the ball last week, and while he's incredibly athletic with the ball in his hands, if you're not running against Georgia, you're probably going to struggle to run against NFL-level defenses as well. So there's some things that we need to try to figure out based on the offense he's in now, and what is translatable to the next level. And those are some of the concerns that NFL teams are kicking around and trying to figure out. But again, he throws the ball on time. He throws the ball generally accurately. He makes a ton of good decisions. Some of that's based on the offense. So there's some things to work with there, but there's some other things you have to wonder how much of this is directly transferable to what he'll do on Sundays next year.
Ryan, you've given us your top 5. I would like you to play Matchmaker right now. I would sing the song, but I am very bad at that. Matchmake these top 5 guys with your favorite NFL teams. So then we talked about Will Levis and the Colts. I'm not sure if that's on your list. What do you got for us?
All right, let's go. So the current draft order, let's work that way. So number 1, the Texans have the number 1 overall pick. You're taking Bryce Young. I know you have Davis Mills. Bryce Young has a chance to be special. Number 2 are the Panthers. We know that David Tepper is done messing around with the quarterback. He's going to take one in the draft, probably pretty early. That's C.J. Stroud by process of elimination. You could argue Will Levis should go there. As we sit here, the Colts have the 14th pick. You would imagine hiring a guy that's never coached football before, maybe they get a higher pick than that. We'll see. Will Levis, as I mentioned earlier, that could be controversial just because Will Levis, I don't think he can come in right away and play. Speaking of controversial, football team, now known as the Commanders, have the 16th pick. Richardson is a guy for the future. Hopefully there's a new ownership conversation. There's more patience preached from the top, and you can be patient with Richardson. I think he could be special, but you shouldn't play him right away. And finally, Hendon Hooker, have him going to the bottom of the second round. The Lions also have a high second-round pick. They continue to rebuild that roster on defense, put some pieces in place offensively. And then late in round 2, you get Hendon Hooker, which is, I think, about the range he may go, maybe slipping into round 3. But that's where we sit right now on, November 10th? Let's check back in a month, and I would imagine all these things will be different.
We'll see what happens over the next month or so. Ryan Wilson, we appreciate it. Check out all of his articles on CBSSports.com. Brian, part of the Pick 6 podcast, latest episode with Will Brinson and company, quarterbacks in the NFL who need to finish strong. Thursday night preview for Falcons and Panthers. And then congrats to our guy, Brady Quinn, because now every time he's on the show, they just call it The Brady Quinn Show. Download and follow.
What an honor.
Do you want a sports network that delivers everything that matters about the game? The highlights, the picks, the instant analysis, no yelling, no fake debates, no politics. Hit the subscribe button and never miss a moment.